40,000 feet above the Solomon Sea, a single B-17 flying fortress pushed through the morning sky toward one of the most dangerous airspaces in the Pacific. There were no other American aircraft nearby, no escort fighters, no protective formation, only one bomber flying alone into territory heavily guarded by the Japanese military. Inside the cockpit, Captain J. Zemer held the control column steady. The bomber's engines droned with the deep mechanical rhythm that B-17 crews knew well. Every vibration traveled through the aircraft's metal frame, through the pilot's seat, through the wounded body of the man guiding it forward. Because Zemer was already bleeding, fragments of metal from earlier hits had torn through both his arms and legs. Blood soaked into the floor beneath the pilot's seat, spreading slowly across the cockpit panels. But the bomber continued flying. Ahead of them lay Buka Island, at the northern end of the Solomon chain. Intelligence officers desperately needed new aerial photographs of the Japanese airfield there. Runways, aircraft positions, anti-aircraft guns, every detail mattered. To capture those photographs, the bomber would have to fly straight and level for 22 minutes directly over the target. In combat aviation, that was almost a death sentence. A bomber flying straight becomes predictable. Fighters can line up their attack runs with deadly precision. Anti-aircraft gunners can calculate lead angles and fire directly into the aircraft's path. Yet Zemer had accepted the mission. The modified B-17 had lifted off before sunrise from Port Moresby, climbing through the humid tropical darkness. The aircraft carried specialized reconnaissance cameras instead of bombs. Its job was not to destroy. Its job was to see. Clear skies stretched across the Coral Sea that morning. Visibility extended for miles in every direction. For reconnaissance photography, that was perfect. For survival, it was disastrous. Without clouds, there was nowhere to hide. The bomber would be visible to enemy radar, enemy fighters, and enemy gunners long before it reached the target. Zemer knew that. So did the 9 men flying with him. They had discussed the mathematics of the mission before takeoff. The distance from Port Moresby to Buka exceeded 500 miles each way. Fuel reserves allowed almost no margin for detours or evasive maneuvers. Every minute spent dodging fighters meant burning fuel they might need to reach home. Every deviation from course risked leaving them stranded over open ocean. Still, the crew had agreed to fly. At 9:35, the first warning came from the ball turret gunner. Small black dots had appeared along the horizon at the bomber's 2 o'clock position. Within minutes, the dots resolved into aircraft. Japanese fighters. 5 of them climbing fast. Zemer did not change course. The cameras needed stability. The mission needed photographs. He kept the bomber perfectly steady as the enemy climbed toward them. The mathematics of interception favored the defenders. Fighters attacking from below had to climb against gravity, burning energy to reach their target. By the time they arrived at the bomber's altitude, they would be slower and less maneuverable, but they would arrive. And once they did, the lone B-17 would face them alone. The first attack came at 9:48. A Japanese fighter swept in from the forward quarter, its guns flashing. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit windows. Zemer could see each glowing projectile tearing through the air toward them. The fighter fired a short burst and broke away into a steep dive. From the top turret, Sergeant Johnny Abel answered with twin .50 caliber machine guns. Brass casings clattered into collection bags beneath the turret as the guns thundered. The fighter disappeared without visible damage. More enemy aircraft were already climbing toward the bomber. By 9:55, the crew counted at least 12 fighters surrounding them, and the photographic run had not even started yet. Zemer checked the instruments. Engine temperatures were stable. Fuel consumption remained within projected limits. For the moment, the aircraft was intact. The crew was functioning, and the mission was still possible. Ahead of them, Buka Island waited. Behind them, the fighters continued climbing. The real battle had not yet begun. The bomber they flew that morning carried an unusual name. Painted unofficially on the aircraft was the nickname Old 666. The name came from the last 3 digits of the bomber's serial number. Many ground crews believed the number brought bad luck. The aircraft had already developed a poor reputation before Zemer ever touched it. By the time he claimed it, the B-17 had been pushed into spare status. It sat neglected on the airfield at Port Moresby, partly stripped for parts and slowly deteriorating under the tropical sun. Engines were unreliable. Equipment had been removed. Maintenance crews preferred to work on aircraft that still had a future. But Zimmer saw something else. He saw potential. Over several weeks, he rebuilt the bomber almost entirely by hand. Parts were scavenged from damaged aircraft scattered across nearby bases. Mechanics helped when they could, but much of the work came from Zimmer's own engineering instinct. And he didn't simply repair the aircraft. He improved it. Additional 50 caliber machine guns were installed wherever space allowed. Ammunition capacity was increased beyond normal configuration. Gun positions were adjusted to reduce blind spots in the bomber's defensive coverage. By the time Zimmer finished, old 666 carried more defensive firepower than a standard B-17. It was no longer just a bomber. It was a flying gun platform, built specifically for missions most crews tried to avoid. Those missions were reconnaissance flights. Long-range penetrations into Japanese-held territory where escort fighters could not reach. A normal bomber group flew in large formations. Dozens of aircraft protected one another with overlapping fields of defensive fire. A reconnaissance B-17 flew alone. If enemy fighters intercepted, there would be no help. Only the crew. And the guns. Zimmer had developed a reputation for these missions. Not because he was reckless, because he understood how to manage risk. His background in engineering shaped how he approached flying. Problems were systems. Systems could be studied. Weak points could be reinforced. He treated aerial combat the same way. Every mission became a calculation. Distance, fuel, enemy reaction time, aircraft performance. The more he understood those variables, the better his chances of survival. Months of flying over the Pacific had taught Zimmer how Japanese air defenses worked. Radar stations along the coast detected approaching aircraft long before they arrived. Fighter units at nearby airfields remained on alert, ready to scramble when warnings arrived. Anti-aircraft guns defended important installations on the ground. The longer an American aircraft remained over enemy territory, the more opposition it would face. 10 minutes over target might bring a handful of fighters. 20 minutes could bring a dozen. 30 minutes might attract every interceptor within range. For reconnaissance pilots, time was the enemy. The best defense was speed. Enter quickly. Capture the photographs. Leave before fighters could reach altitude. Zimmer drilled his crew until every step of the process became automatic. Cross the initial point at the correct altitude and heading. Activate the cameras. Maintain steady flight during the photographic run. Terminate recording at the final point. Begin the withdrawal turn immediately. Every second saved reduced the chances of interception. That system had worked before. Reconnaissance flights over Kavieng, Wewak, and other Japanese positions had produced valuable intelligence. Fighters usually arrived too late to prevent the photography. But Buka would be different. Intelligence required full coverage of the airfield complex. That meant either multiple passes or one extended photographic run. Both options meant spending far more time over the target than usual. Time the Japanese fighters would certainly use. There was another complication. Buka lay near the extreme operational range of B-17s flying from Port Moresby. Fuel calculations were tight. Very tight. Any prolonged maneuvering could leave the aircraft short of friendly territory during the return flight. Combat damage that reduced engine efficiency could produce the same result. Zimmer knew all of this before accepting the mission. He knew Japanese fighter strength at Buka might exceed anything his crew had faced before. Still, he agreed to fly. The intelligence value was too important, and the crew trusted him. The preparation began days before the mission. Zimmer studied every photograph and intelligence report available about the airfield. He estimated interception times based on radar coverage and fighter readiness. Multiple escape routes were plotted in case emergency landings became necessary. Meanwhile, the crew prepared the aircraft. Gunners cleaned their weapons and inspected ammunition belts. The radio operator verified emergency communication frequencies. Navigator Lieutenant Ruby Johnston updated charts and calculated backup navigation points for use if primary references failed. The evening before the mission, Zimmer gathered his crew. There was no dramatic speech. No attempt at motivation. He simply laid out the facts. Distance to target. Expected enemy resistance. Fuel limitations. Abort conditions. Each man understood the situation completely. By dawn the next morning, they were already climbing into the Pacific sky. And now, as the Japanese fighters closed in around them, The crew of Old 666 prepared to face the battle they had expected all along. The cameras were about to begin recording, and for the next 22 minutes, the bomber would not be allowed to turn. The fighters knew it, the gunners knew it, and Captain Ziemer knew it. The only thing left was to survive it. At 9:58, the photographic run began. Navigator Lieutenant Ruby Johnston confirmed their position over the initial point, and the reconnaissance cameras mounted in the belly of the bomber came to life. From that moment forward, the aircraft had to remain perfectly steady. Any turn, any climb, any sudden change in speed, even the smallest deviation could blur the photographs and ruin the entire mission. So Captain J. Ziemer held the bomber straight and level. Below them, Buka Island slid slowly beneath the wings. Ahead of them, Japanese fighters closed in. The attacks began almost immediately. Enemy aircraft approached from the front quarter, firing bursts as they passed through the bomber's defensive perimeter. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit windows. Some tore through the bomber's aluminum skin, leaving ragged holes across the wings and fuselage. Inside the aircraft, the gunners responded. From the top turret, waist positions, tail guns, and the ball turret. 50 caliber machine guns roared to life. Short, controlled bursts. Carefully aimed. Every round mattered. They were far from home, and the ammunition carried aboard the bomber was all they had. Inside the ball turret beneath the aircraft, Sergeant Kendrick rotated constantly, trying to track enemy fighters as they flashed past. The small spherical turret allowed him to fire in almost any direction, but the fighters were moving fast, appearing suddenly, firing their own weapons, and disappearing before the guns could fully follow. The sky around the bomber filled with motion. Engines, gunfire, tracers, smoke. In the cockpit, time began to behave strangely. Ziemer would later describe the experience as if seconds had stretched into minutes. Every moment seemed longer than it should have been. The mind forced itself to absorb enormous amounts of information at once. Enemy aircraft positions, instrument readings, engine behavior, crew reports, and the pain from his wounds. Because the bomber had already taken serious hits. Fragments from exploding shells had torn into Ziemer's arms and legs. Blood spread across the cockpit floor beneath him, slowly soaking into the metal panels. Still, his hand stayed firmly on the controls. The aircraft never left its course. At 10:02, the damage worsened. A Japanese fighter diving from the 2 o'clock position fired a burst that struck directly through the cockpit. The impact rattled the entire aircraft. Metal fragments tore through the pilot's compartment. Ziemer felt the shock of the hits before he heard the sound. Shrapnel cut through his arms and legs, embedding itself deep into muscle and bone. Blood flowed freely now, but the bomber stayed steady. Beside him, Johnston quietly took over throttle management. Maintaining level flight required constant adjustments. Air currents pushed the aircraft off course. Combat damage increased drag on one side of the airframe. Even small changes could disturb the stability required for the cameras below. Despite the growing numbness in his hands, Ziemer continued making those tiny corrections. In the nose compartment, Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski fought his own battle. His position placed him at the very front of the aircraft, directly exposed to head-on attacks from enemy fighters. Twin 50 caliber machine guns mounted beside the nose compartment allowed him to fire forward at approaching aircraft. As fighters dove toward the bomber, Sarnowski tracked them through his sights. The guns fired in long bursts. Barrels heated rapidly. Smoke drifted back along the fuselage. Then, at 10:08, a 20mm shell exploded inside the nose section. The blast slammed into Sarnowski at close range. Fragments tore through his chest and face. The concussion threw him backward against his seat, knocking him unconscious for several seconds. When he regained awareness, blood clouded his vision. His left arm hung nearly useless at his side. But the fighters were still coming. So Sarnowski forced himself back to the guns. Across the bomber, other crew members were also wounded. A waist gunner took fragments in the shoulder but refused to leave his position. The radio operator suffered cuts from shattered plexiglass but continued calling out fighter positions. The ball turret gunner reported rounds striking the turret dome but kept rotating and firing. No one asked to abort the mission, because aborting would change nothing. They were already more than 500 miles from friendly territory. Fuel reserves allowed only the direct route home. The best chance of survival was to finish the mission. For 22 minutes, the bomber flew through continuous attack. Enemy fighters circled, dove, fired, climbed away, then returned again. Each time they met the same wall of defensive fire. The B-17's gunners could not always destroy their attackers outright, but they could damage them. Engines began smoking. Control surfaces were struck. Pilots were forced to break away. One by one, the attackers felt the cost of closing too near the American bomber. At 10:20, the photographic run finally ended. 22 minutes of straight flight through relentless fighter attack. Inside the cameras, the film had captured everything. Runways, aircraft, gun positions, all of it. The intelligence officers back at Port Moresby would soon have exactly what they needed. Now Zimmer could finally turn. But the moment he began the withdrawal maneuver, the danger would change. And the battle above the Solomon Sea was far from over. At 10:20, Captain J. Zimmer finally began the turn that would carry the bomber away from Buka. For 22 minutes, the aircraft had flown straight and level through relentless fighter attacks. Now the bomber had to change course. And that moment created its own danger. A bomber flying level presents a stable defensive pattern. Every gun position has a predictable field of fire. Gunners know exactly where to expect incoming aircraft. But during a turn, everything changes. Some guns suddenly lose their firing angles. Others gain new coverage. For a few brief seconds, gaps appear in the defensive envelope. Experienced fighter pilots watch for those moments. The Japanese pilots saw the turn instantly. 3 fighters that had been circling at a distance dove in together, converging on the bomber as it rolled out of its bank. Zimmer kept the maneuver shallow. The aircraft required roughly a 40-degree course change to begin the return toward Port Moresby. Instead of forcing the damaged bomber through a sharp turn, he stretched the maneuver across nearly half a minute. The control cables running through the wings had already been damaged by earlier hits. If he pushed the aircraft too hard, they might fail completely. So the turn came slowly, painfully slowly. In the nose compartment, Joseph Sarnowski, badly wounded and bleeding heavily, tracked the lead fighter approaching from above. The Japanese aircraft dove steeply from the 11 o'clock position, gaining speed rapidly as gravity pulled it toward the bomber. Sarnowski opened fire at long range. Tracer rounds streamed outward from his guns. He walked the fire toward the target as the distance closed. Then the bullets began to strike. The fighter's engine cowling shattered under repeated .50 caliber impacts. Smoke burst from the engine as oil lines ruptured. Flames appeared along the power plant. The Japanese aircraft broke off the attack and spiraled downward toward the sea. But the attacks did not stop. Japanese fighters continued pressing their advantage. They dove through the bomber's defensive fire again and again, hoping to land the hit that would finally destroy the aircraft. Inside the B-17, the gunners kept firing. They rarely destroyed enemy fighters outright, but they damaged them. Engines were punctured, fuel lines ruptured, control cables severed. Even small hits could cripple a fighter hundreds of miles from home. Gradually, the attackers began paying the price for their aggression. Intercepted Japanese radio transmissions from that period would later reveal what the enemy pilots were experiencing. They were frustrated. The American bomber should have fallen long ago. It had taken visible damage. Smoke trailed from parts of the aircraft. And yet it refused to go down. Its defensive fire remained fierce. Any fighter that came too close risked being shot apart. One intercepted message issued a direct order to concentrate all available aircraft against the lone bomber. Every fighter in the area was instructed to join the attack. Ironically, that decision made the situation more difficult for the Japanese pilots. As more aircraft crowded around the bomber, the airspace became chaotic. Fighters approached from multiple directions at once. Pilots had to avoid colliding with each other. Some firing passes had to be aborted because friendly aircraft crossed through the line of fire. The air around the bomber turned into a deadly traffic jam. Zimmer's gunners took advantage of it. They fired into the narrow lanes where attacking fighters were forced to pass. Any aircraft entering those zones faced a wall of machine gun fire. Some attackers broke away. Others were hit. Inside the bomber, ammunition belts disappeared rapidly. Barrels glowed with heat. The smell of burned powder filled the aircraft. Still, the gunners kept firing. Around 10:30, the attacks began to slow. Not because the Japanese had run out of aircraft, but because the bomber kept flying farther and farther from Buka. Each mile of pursuit increased the risk for the fighters. They were now far from their airfields. Fuel reserves were becoming a concern. Continuing the chase meant risking a long flight back over open ocean. Now the Japanese pilots faced the same calculation Zimmer had made earlier. Continue the pursuit, or turn back and survive. One by one, the fighters peeled away. The battle was ending. But the ordeal was far from over for the crew of Old 666. Their aircraft had suffered catastrophic damage. Fuel leaked from several tanks. Hydraulic systems had failed. Control surfaces responded sluggishly. Yet somehow the engines continued running, and the bomber continued flying south. The journey home would take 4.5 hours. 4.5 hours in a crippled aircraft. 4.5 hours while the crew fought injuries, exhaustion, and the constant fear that the airplane might fail before reaching friendly territory. Captain Zimmer remained at the controls. Under normal circumstances, his wounds would have grounded any pilot instantly. But this was not normal. The damaged bomber needed constant correction. Trim had shifted as fuel leaked unevenly between tanks. Hundreds of holes in the airframe created new aerodynamic drag. The aircraft no longer handled the way it had that morning. So Zimmer adapted. He flew the bomber he still had, not the one he had started with. Small adjustments, careful corrections, learning the aircraft's new behavior minute by minute. As long as the engines kept turning, there was still hope. The flight back to Port Moresby lasted more than 4.5 hours. 4.5 hours inside an aircraft that was barely holding together. Fuel leaked steadily from punctured tanks. Hydraulic pressure had vanished from most of the control systems. Hundreds of holes scarred the bomber's wings and fuselage, each one adding drag and instability to the aircraft's flight. Inside the cockpit, Captain J. Zimmer fought to stay conscious. Blood loss from his wounds had grown severe. Several times during the return flight his head drifted forward before he forced himself awake again. But he could not leave the controls. The damaged B-17 required constant attention. Even small shifts in airspeed or altitude could send the aircraft drifting off course. Every minute demanded careful adjustments to keep the bomber flying. Beside him, Navigator Ruby Johnston monitored the instruments and plotted the course back toward New Guinea. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath them. If the engines failed now, there would be no rescue. Throughout the aircraft, the crew remained at their stations. Several men were wounded. Makeshift bandages had been applied where possible, but there was little medical equipment available on board. Still, the gunners stayed at their weapons. Japanese airfields existed throughout the region. If another group of fighters intercepted them during the long return flight, the bomber would still need every gun operational. No one abandoned their position. They endured the flight together. In the nose compartment, Joseph Sarnowski had continued fighting long after his injuries should have stopped him. But at some point during the withdrawal from Buka, his strength finally failed. Another crewman crawled forward to check on him. Sarnowski was slumped over his guns, unresponsive. The wounds from the exploding shell had been fatal. There was nothing anyone could do. The bomber continued its long journey south with one crew member already gone. Nearly an hour before reaching Port Moresby, the radio operator finally managed to transmit a message to the base. The signal reported heavy aircraft damage and multiple wounded aboard. The airfield responded immediately. Crashed trucks, medical crews, and ambulances moved into position along the runway. Everyone on the ground understood that the incoming aircraft might not survive the landing. As the coastline of New Guinea appeared ahead, Zimmer prepared for the most difficult part of the entire flight. Landing a heavily damaged aircraft is often more dangerous than flying it. The bomber's hydraulic system had failed, which meant the landing gear and flaps had to be deployed using emergency procedures. Crew members watched through the waist windows as the landing gear slowly lowered. After 10 seconds, they confirmed that the wheels had locked into position. The flaps extended only partially before the damaged system stopped responding entirely. It would have to be enough. Zimmer guided the battered bomber toward the runway. The aircraft touched down hard. The damaged landing gear absorbed the impact poorly. The bomber bounced violently once, then again, before slamming back onto the runway. For a moment, it seemed the landing gear might collapse completely. But somehow it held. Using careful braking and rudder control, Zimmer kept the aircraft straight until it slowed enough to roll to a stop. Only then did he release the controls. The engines fell silent. The mission was finally over. Zimmer could not leave the cockpit on his own. Ground crews rushed to the aircraft and pulled him from his seat, placing him on a stretcher beside the other wounded crew members. Medical personnel quickly discovered the extent of his injuries. Shrapnel had torn into both arms, both legs, and his torso. He had lost enough blood to enter shock. Doctors rushed him into surgery. Meanwhile, intelligence officers removed the film canisters from the aircraft's cameras. Those photographs had been the entire reason for the mission. Within hours, the images were developed. They were exactly what planners had hoped for. Sharp, clear, complete. The photographs revealed the full layout of the Japanese airfield at Buka, including runways, aircraft positions, and defensive gun placements. That intelligence would shape American operations in the region for months. The mission had succeeded. For his actions that day, Captain J. Zimmer Jr. received the Medal of Honor. The official citation described how he remained at the controls of his aircraft and directed its defense despite being severely wounded. It mentioned the number of attacking fighters. It recorded the completion of the reconnaissance mission. But like most official citations, it could not truly describe what those 40 minutes over Buka had been like. The explosions, the gunfire, the smell of smoke and burning metal inside the aircraft, or the reality of flying a bomber while your own body was failing. Lieutenant Joseph Sarnosky also received the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously. His citation recognized how he continued firing on enemy aircraft despite wounds that would soon kill him. 2 Medals of Honor for a single mission was rare. The remaining crew members received Silver Stars and Distinguished Flying Crosses. Their performance had saved the aircraft and each other. Captain Zimmer spent months recovering from his injuries. Multiple surgeries were required before he could even walk again. Eventually, he returned to flying, though not to the same type of combat missions. The war had already taken its share from him. After 1945, Zimmer returned to civilian life and resumed the engineering career he had begun before the war. He never sought publicity. He rarely spoke about the mission. For him, it had simply been the job that needed to be done. He lived quietly for decades afterward, passing away in 2007 at the age of 88. The bomber Old 666 never flew another combat mission. The damage it had absorbed over Buka was too severe to repair economically. The aircraft was stripped for usable parts and eventually scrapped. Yet the modifications Zimmer had installed, the extra guns, the increased ammunition capacity, had played a crucial role in the crew's survival. His engineering instincts had built an aircraft capable of enduring what happened that morning. Above the Solomon Sea that day, Japanese forces had thrown everything they had at a single bomber. 17 fighters, continuous attacks, relentless gunfire. And still the aircraft had escaped, because 10 men inside that machine had functioned as a single system. Each man depending on the others. Each decision affecting everyone on board. History often records the outcome of events. A mission completed, photographs delivered, intelligence gathered. But behind those results are the quieter truths of war. A pilot holding the controls while bleeding from multiple wounds. A bombardier returning to his guns even when he could barely stand. A crew choosing to finish a mission even when survival seemed unlikely. That is what courage in the air often looks like. Not dramatic speeches, not heroic gestures, just steady hands on the controls, and the decision to keep flying. Even when everything says you should not survive.